Hi, everyone. This is the solution video for the class activity we did on the endocrine system. And what you can see, I'm sharing the screen, shows you the worksheet that we used. Basically, what we talked about is how the endocrine system is one of the extrinsic control systems of other organs. And it does that through signaling molecules called hormones. And a hormone gets released into the blood and courses around the circulatory system. And it can leak out into any capillary bed, but it will only affect target organs that have the specific receptor for that hormone. And so once the hormone binds to that target receptor, and it depends on what that receptor is. We've looked at this before. It could be a G protein cascade. It could be an ion channel that opens. It could be a receptor enzyme complex. So remember, we did in another homework assignment, G protein complexes and receptor enzyme complexes. So you might want to look back at those and review. But this really is just showing the pathway of the sequence of glands and the hormones they release until they get to their target organ to change the activity of that organ. Okay. The hormones that or the control, there's kind of two ways that we can control this. One can be through the hypothalamus, and this is kind of the classic control system, what I call hypothalamus will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, which will then stimulate another gland, endocrine gland, which will then stimulate another organ, right? So we're going to see this flow chart showing this pathway of stimulation in order to get the result that we want. Okay? The hormones that get released out of these hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are called tropic hormones. So tropic hormone means it just regulates the hormone secretion of another endocrine gland. So keep that in mind as we go through these pathways. Okay. We will see a few systems, though, that doesn't need to go through any stimulation of the hypothalamus. The organ can be stimulated directly, or the gland can be. And so we'll see that example in the pancreas, the parathyroid glands, and also within the kidney as well. Okay, so we'll do those examples. Another thing, though, well, I'll mention this a little bit later. So again, what you'll see in a lot of these, you can see on the screen is there will be a goal in mind. What is the goal that this pathway, what we're trying to achieve? And so in this case, we want to increase metabolism. And so I'm giving you the endocrine pathway via the thyroid gland. But what you're going to have to do is learn, well, how does a thyroid gland first get stimulated? And it's that one's going to start with the hypothalamus. Okay, so you need to know the uh, portion that the organ that's releasing the hormone. You need to know the hormone itself, and then you need to know the target tissue. And there might be several steps to that until we finally reach our goal here, which is metabolism. Another way that the question could be presented is in the second question you see there. One symptom of hypothyroidism is an enlarged thyroid gland, or in extreme cases, a goiter. Use the negative feedback system of the hormonal control system of the thyroid and explain how a goiter could develop. And so that then we're kind of using, a disease state. So to tackle that, though, you first need to know what is the normal state, and then you can see where it goes wrong. So let's start with that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a whiteboard so that I can just step through and draw on this myself. Go. All right. Make sure I'm going to make this nice and thick. Okay. So here's our whiteboard. So again, in order to stimulate the thyroid gland, in this case, we're going to start with the hypothalamus. Okay, and the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone that will, there it is. Now you can see it. It will release a hormone that will, sorry, I was just seeing if I can get rid of that. I don't know how to get, I'm afraid to do that. So it's going to release a hormone that is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland. So that's always the next gland in this series. Hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary gland. So the hormones that the hypothalamus releases is a tropic hormone because it's going to stimulate another endocrine gland. That was one of the definitions. But out of the hypothalamus, the hormone always has the word releasing in it. That's how you know it's the hormone from the hypothalamus. And releasing because it's telling the anterior pituitary to release a hormone. Okay. So in this case, again, eventually we want to stimulate the thyroid gland. So the hormone that gets released from the hypothalamus is thyrotropin releasing hormone. And that's all you have to write is the abbreviation there. You don't have to write the whole thing out. But again, thyroid releasing hormone. And again, coming from the hypothalamus, it has that R in there, meaning releasing. So we know then that with the thyroid releasing hormone, that is going to target the anterior pituitary. Okay, and you can write gland or not. It's fine with me if you don't write gland. So releasing hormones, their target organ, target cells are always the cells of the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, and so the anterior pituitary is made up of different clusters of epithelial cells that make different hormones. And so one of the hormone it makes is, I'm going to say, thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and so that cluster of epithelial cells that are within the anterior pituitary gland, again, they know to release thyroid stimulating hormone because TRH is what stimulated those cells then to release TSH. Okay, so it's nice. Sometimes things in physiology are easy. I'm going to scroll this up a little bit. Thyroid stimulating hormone then stimulates the thyroid gland. And again, you can write gland or not. I'll be okay with that. Okay. And so the thyroid gland now is the gland that can release the hormone that'll go into regular circulation in order to target the other cells to increase their metabolism. So that's the next step we need to write is what does thyroid gland release? Well, it releases two types of hormones, T3 and T4. Okay, and so please go back to the lecture video in order to understand the difference between T3 and T4. But these go into regular circulation, and when it does so, okay, in this case, the target cells, it's widespread, it's most cells of the body. So I'm just going to say most cells, right? And again, the goal was to increase metabolism. So that just means that most of these cells are going to start to produce more ATP and doing some of the other chemical reactions that they tend to do. Okay, so we did it. This is the flow chart that I want you, there we go, that I want you to be able to see or want you to be able to draw out. This is the simple answer to that question. It doesn't have to be any more complex than this. You don't have to go into widespread explanation. This is what I want. We're not done yet though, because there is a negative feedback system. Because as T3 and T4 goes into regular circulation, what'll happen is as that builds up in the blood, that blood, of course, goes by our other glands, and as it gets the blood courses by the anterior pituitary gland, and again, as the T3 and T4 builds up, there's a negative feedback on that gland. There can also be a negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Okay. And so by negatively feeding back, what it's saying is that the cells of the body have increased their metabolism. Okay. And so we don't want metabolism to run away, get too high. And so as we get a particular level of T3 and T4 in the general bloodstream, it gets to a high enough level that as it comes back around, that bloodstream comes back around to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, then it can serve as a negative feedback. So then the anterior pituitary will release less TSH, right? And then there'll be less stimulation of the thyroid gland. So it'll start to decrease its release of T3, T4, right? And so it's just kind of regulating then that metabolism within a particular homeostatic range, okay? So that's the normal pathway in order to stimulate our cells, stimulate metabolism. So the next question is, well, what happens in hypothyroidism? And it said that it can produce a enlarged thyroid or a goiter. Well, we can use this track in order to understand that. So again, hypothyroidism means that there's a decrease, there's a small amount of, I'm going to use a different color here, T3, T4, right? So that amount that's being released out of the thyroid gland is actually low, hypothyroidism, okay? So if this is low, then what that'll mean is that there won't be a negative feedback occurring to the anterior pituitary. So if there's no negative feedback on the anterior pituitary, then it's going to continue to release TSH, which will continue to stimulate the thyroid gland. But again, our T3, T4 levels stay low because something's going wrong with the thyroid gland. Okay, at this point, it doesn't matter what, but it could be we call it could be a tumor in the thyroid gland, so it's unable to produce T3, T4. T3, we might not have enough iodine in our nutrition, and so if we don't get enough iodine, then we can't make adequate amount of T3, T4. That's what the 3 and 4 are referring to, is the iodine that's associated with it. Okay, so basically then what happens is no matter how much the anterior pituitary is releasing thyroid releasing hormone, the thyroid gland is unable to produce T3, T4, so it stays low. So again, you don't get the negative feedback, okay? However, with this continuous stimulation on the thyroid gland, one of the other properties of a tropic hormone, which again, what TSH is and TRH is it tends to cause the target organ, the gland, it stimulates a little bit of growth in order for it then to make and release the hormone. So knowing that about tropic hormones, again, as thyroid gland is being bombarded with T3, T4, okay, then the thyroid gland is getting larger and larger. And so that would cause an enlarged gland. And if this really goes for a long time, then you get a goiter. And that's the answer to that second part of the regarding hypothyroidism, the second question. Okay. We can use this to look at, so let me erase some things here. Okay. Oops. we can use this pathway. We'll put our negative feedback loop back, to look at even something called hyperthyroidism, right? So with hyperthyroidism, then you're getting an increase or too much T3, T4. And so then you get a really high increase of metabolism. And so one of the causes of hypothyroidism is something called hyperthyroidism. Write that, hyperthyroid is called Graves' disease. Okay. And so in Graves' disease, this is an autoimmune disease. And I'm just going to get some space here. What happens with Graves' disease is we produce, I'm going to use red again. It's an autoimmune disease. So we produce a molecule called TSI, which stands for thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins. So it's an antibody. Okay, and the body isn't supposed to produce this, but in this case with Graves' disease, it does. And what it does is it stimulates the thyroid gland directly, and that causes the thyroid gland to produce more and more T3 and T4. Okay? And so you will have the negative feedback. Okay. But that then causes, because there's a negative feedback, then the anterior pituitary is not releasing TSH. And you think, okay, so then the thyroid isn't getting stimulated. Yes, it is. It's this erroneous antibody that's doing it. So it upsets the pathway, but the thyroid gland is still being stimulated and it has the ability to make T3, T4. And so you get hyperthyroidism. Okay. And again, really high metabolism going on. Okay. So that is the first one. So let me go back to our questions here. I'm going to screen share this one. Okay. So we did those first two. So here now it says, describe the pathway of adrenal gland stimulation of cortisol release. Cortisol to increase plasma glucose levels and other metabolic fuels. So basically, we just know that cortisol, mostly we look at it increasing glucose levels, but just understand it can also increase fatty acids, amino acids, but we'll just focus on the glucose in order to make it a little bit easier. Okay. And again, we're going to include all the target cells, the hormones, the negative feedback. So if it says include all the target cells, I want everything. Even the endocrine glands in the sequence is a target cell. Okay. So you want to make sure that you include everything on there. All righty. We could even look at, I didn't put it on this paper, but what if I said, what happens if there's a hypersecretion of cortisol? So the first thing you want to do is write down the normal secretion of cortisol, and then you can figure out what's gone wrong. Okay. So again, let me go back now and we're going to share a whiteboard. And to speed things up, let's see. Yep. Sorry, I got all kinds of things going on here to help us. Okay, so in this one, we're also going to start with the hypothalamus. Let me make that thicker so it's easier to see. Hypothalamus. Okay, and so we need a releasing hormone. And in this case, the releasing hormone is called corticotropin releasing hormone. So yes, there is some memory that you have to do here. You have to know the names of these hormones, okay? Again, I'm not requiring that you write the whole thing out, but you should at least understand what the name is. And here's why. Again, the question said the release of cortisol through the adrenal gland. And so this hormone is called corticotropin, right? Releasing hormone. So it has kind of the beginnings of cortisol in the name. So releasing hormones always act on the anterior pituitary. Okay, I'm going to abbreviate it just for speed right now. So the anterior pituitary then releases a hormone that will stimulate the adrenal gland. And so that hormone will be ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, adrenal gland, corticotropic, the cortisol, tropic hormone, right? And one of the things to realize too is that the adrenal gland can release different hormones. So this one tells us the specific hormone that it's actually going to release. Okay, so the target there now is the adrenal gland. We almost always say adrenal gland in full. We don't just say the adrenal, I guess the adrenals. But in particular, there are 3 zones within the cortex of the adrenal gland, and it all starts with zona, glomerulosa, right? Zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. I almost forgot the name. Okay, so you need to know which one this one targets. And in this one, it's the zona fasciculata. Okay. And the one way I remember that is, cortisol, a lot of us think of it as a stress hormone. It is when you're under stress. And what happens when you're under stress? You tend to gain a lot of weight. So I think fasciculata, a lot of weight. So the adrenal gland, then again, ACTH targets the zona fasciculata, causing that to release cortisol. Okay. And the target cells here, I'm going to move this up a bit so we can see it. The target cells for cortisol, often it is, again, the goal is to increase plasma glucose levels and other metabolic fuels. So one of the ways it can do that is through the liver, through adipose tissue, right? And even skeletal muscle cells, but usually when the skeletal muscle cells are at rest. But again, so basically, it can also hit most of your other cells, so most cells, but what it's going to do here is it inhibits glucose uptake. Right? In like your liver, it actually stimulates, I'm just going to put stimulates gluconeogenesis. Remember, that's making glucose from amino acids. It can stimulate lipolysis here. And remember, when we do that, we can make lipolysis. We're breaking down the fatty acids and we can convert those into glucose, right? The liver also can stimulate glucogenesis, And so again, that's taking the storage form, the glucagon, and converting it back to glucose. So anything that's going to increase plasma glucose levels, okay, that's the job of cortisol. And the reason why we tend to gain weight is in this world we live in now, and this many of us in this country, food is abundant, and when you're stressed, you still produce this response. This still occurs, but we already have abundant fuel. And so that then will ultimately, the body will realize, oh, we already have too much glucose, and it may then convert that into fat again. Okay. But under stress, before we had food that we can store and be more abundant, when you were under stress, stress usually meant that we're using a lot of fuel and we don't have access to more fuel, more food. And so we go through this to release more glucose in order to be able to continue our body processes. Okay. Again, so we could have something called cortisol hypersecretion that's known as Cushing syndrome. And so you can get an overstimulation of the adrenal gland because there's excessive amounts of CRH and or ACTH, right? There could be an adrenal tumor that can uncontrollably secrete too much cortisol, and that's independent of what's the ACTH. Okay. There could be a tumor in the anterior pituitary gland that's causing it to secrete too much ACTH, right? So you get hyperglycemia, which is increased blood glucose, um, glucosuria, that means glucose in the kidneys. And so that can be a form of diabetes caused by the adrenal gland. Okay. There could be adrenocortical insufficiency, that's Addison's disease, usually caused by an autoimmune disease. And if it's causing the adrenal gland to not be able to release sufficient amount of cortisol, then you get a poor response to stress. You get low blood sugar or hypoglycemia, right? Your metabolism may go low because even if the thyroid gland is working correctly, well, you need glucose to fuel metabolism. So that could be low. Okay, so there's several things that could occur there.